enthusiasts, which includes me, have agreed to choose and read an extract from a novel or a letter which they particularly like. Not necessarily an easy thing to do, so I'm very grateful to them for having given a great deal of their time to do this. We start with the 20-year-old Jane and move through her life and writing to its end in 1817. So in order of appearance, we have Daisy Houlihan, Matthew White, Angela Barlow, Sabine Perhaus, and Janet Pryke. They will all introduce their readings themselves, and I'm coming in last to round off what we all hope you'll enjoy. So, over to Daisy.
Jane Austen was just 20 in January 1796, a bright and lively young woman who was thoroughly enjoying her Christmas festivities in and around Steventon, Hampshire. The surrounding neighbourhood had many families with whom the Austens were friendly, and in the following letters to her sister Cassandra, Jane mentions some of them, as well as her brothers Henry and Charles. In particular, there was young Tom Lefroy, the Irish nephew of Jane's especial friend, Mrs. Anne Lefroy, who was staying with his uncle and aunt at Ash Rectory. Jane and Tom were immediately attracted to each other, and as both of them were good dancers, had made rather an exhibition of themselves at the various local balls. In these extracts from the first two of her surviving letters, the unrepentant and irrepressible Jane teases Cassandra with an account of how badly she's already behaved, and how she expects her last evening with Tom Lefroy to end. This short-lived friendship has generally been seen as Jane's big romance, and it wasn't really a romance, but it certainly was a flirtation, and her behaviour over these few days embarrassed her in later years. On to the first letter. Steventon, Saturday. In the first place, I hope you will live 23 years longer. Mr. Tom Lefroy's birthday was yesterday, so you are very near of an age. After this necessary preamble, I shall proceed to inform you that we had an exceedingly good ball last night, and that I was very much disappointed at not seeing Charles Fowle of the party, as I had previously heard of his being invited. In addition to our set at the Harwoods ball, we had the Grant St. John's, Lady Rivers, her 3 daughters and a son, Mr. and Mrs. Heathcote, Miss Lefevre, 2 Mr. Watkins, Mr. J. Portal, Miss Deans, 2 Miss Ledgers, and a tall clergyman who came with them, whose name Mary never would have guessed. We were so terribly good as to take James in our carriage, though there were 3 of us before. But indeed, he deserves encouragement for the very great improvement which has lately taken place in his dancing. Miss Heathcote is pretty, but not near so handsome as I expected. Mr. H. began with Elizabeth, and afterwards danced with her again, but they do not know how to be particular. I flatter myself, however, that they will profit by the 3 successive lessons which I have now given them. You scold me so much in the nice long letter which I have this moment received from you, that I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together. I can expose myself, however, only once more, because he leaves the country soon after next Friday, on which day we are to have a dance at Ash after all. He is a very gentlemanlike, good-looking, pleasant young man, I assure you, but as to our ever having met, except at the 3 last balls, I cannot say much, for he is so excessively laughed at about me at Ash, that he's ashamed of coming to Steventon, and ran away when we called on Mrs. Lefroy a few days ago. We left Warren at Dean Gate in our way home last night, and he is now on his road to town. He left his love, etc. to you, and I will deliver it when we meet. Henry goes to Harden today in his way to his master's degree. We shall feel the loss of these two most agreeable young men exceedingly, and shall have nothing to console us till the arrival of the Coopers on Tuesday. As they will stay here till the Monday following, perhaps Caroline will go to the Ash Ball with me, though I dare say she will not. I danced twice with Warren last night, and once with Mr. Charles Watkins, and, to my inexpressible astonishment, I entirely escaped John Lyford. I was forced to fight hard for it, however. We had a very good supper, and the greenhouse was illuminated in a very elegant manner. We had a visit yesterday morning from Mr. Benjamin Portal, whose eyes are as handsome as ever. Everybody is extremely anxious for your return, but as you cannot come home by the Ash Ball, I am glad that I've not fed them false hopes. James danced with Alethea and cut up the turkey last night with great perseverance. You say nothing of silk stockings. I flatter myself, therefore, that Charles has not purchased any, as I cannot very well afford to pay for them. All my money is spent in buying white gloves and pink Persian. I wish Charles had been at Manydown, because he would have given you some description of my friend, and I think you must be impatient to hear something about him. Henry is still hankering after the regulars, and as his project of purchasing the adjutancy of the Oxfordshire is now over, he's got a scheme in his head about getting a lieutenancy and adjutancy in the 86th. It's a new raised regiment, which he fancies will be ordered to the Cape of Good Hope. I heartily hope that he will, as usual, be disappointed in this scheme. We've trimmed up and given away all the old paper hats of Mamma's manufacture. I hope you will not regret the loss of yours. As I had written the above, we received a visit from Mr. Tom Lefroy and his cousin George. The latter is really very well behaved now. As for the former, he has but one fault, which time will, I trust, entirely remove. It is that his morning coat is a great deal too light. He is a very great admirer of Tom Jones, and therefore wears the same coloured clothes, I imagine, which he did when he was wounded. Jane Austen. To the second letter. To Miss Austen, Newbury. Friday. At length the day is come on which I am to flirt my last with Tom Lefroy, and when you receive this, it will be over. My tears flow as I write at the melancholy idea. William Shute was here yesterday. I wonder what he means by being so civil. There is a report that Tom is going to be married to a Lichfield lass. John Lyfield and his sister bring Edward home today, dine with us, and we shall all go together to Ash. I understand that we're to draw for partners. I shall be extremely impatient to hear from you again, that I may know how Eliza is and when you were to return. With best love, I am affectionately yours, Jane Austen. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. And now Matthew.
Thank you and good evening. My reading is taken from Northanger Abbey. As Diana explained, this wasn't published until after Jane had died, and it had been titled Susan. This extract shows her understanding of men's interests, which she turns to good account in the foolishness of John Thorpe and her ambiguity regarding marriage. She entered the rooms on Thursday evening with feelings very different from what had attended her thither the Monday before. She had then been exulting in her engagement to Thorpe, and was now chiefly anxious to avoid his sight, lest he should engage her again. For though she could not, dared not expect that Mr. Tilney would ask her for a third time to dance, her wishes, hopes, and plans all centred on nothing less. Every young lady may feel for my heroine in this critical moment, for every young lady has at some time or another the same agitation. All have been, or at least all have believed themselves to be, in danger from the pursuit of someone whom they wish to avoid. And all have been anxious for the attentions of someone whom they wished to please. As soon as they were joined by the Thorpes, Catherine's agony began. She fidgeted about if John Thorpe came towards her, hid herself as much as possible from his view, and when he spoke to her, pretended not to hear him. The cotillions were over, the country dancing began, and she saw nothing of the Tilneys. "Do not be frightened, my dear Catherine," whispered Isabella, "but I am really going to dance with your brother again. I declare positively it is quite shocking. I tell him he ought to be ashamed of himself, but you and John must keep us in countenance. Make haste, my dear creature, and come to us. John has just walked off, but he will be back in a moment." Catherine had neither time nor inclination to answer. The others walked away. John Thorpe was still in view, and she gave herself up for lost. That she might not appear, however, to observe or expect him, she kept her eyes intently fixed on her fan, and a self-condemnation for her folly, in supposing that among such a crowd they should even meet with the Tilneys in any reasonable time, had just passed through her mind, when she suddenly found herself addressed and again solicited to dance by Mr. Tilney himself. With what sparkling eyes and ready motion she granted his request, and with how pleasing a flutter of heart she went with him to the set, may be easily imagined. To escape, and as she believed so narrowly escape, John Thorpe, and to be asked so immediately on his joining her, asked by Mr. Tilney, as if he had sought her on purpose, it did not appear to her that life could supply any greater felicity. Scarcely had they worked themselves into the quiet possession of a place, however, when her attention was claimed by John Thorpe, who stood behind her. "Hey day, Miss Morland," said he. "What is the meaning of this? I thought you and I were to dance together." "I wonder you should think so, for you never asked me." "That's a good one, by Jove. I asked you as soon as I came into the room, and I was just going to ask you again, but when I turned round, you were gone. This is a cursed shabby trick. I only came for the sake of dancing with you, and I firmly believe you were engaged to me ever since Monday. Yes, I remember. I asked you while you were waiting in the lobby for your cloak. And here I have been telling all my acquaintance that I was going to dance with the prettiest girl in the room, and when they see you standing up with somebody else, they will quiz me famously. Oh no, they will never think of me in such a description as that. By heavens, if they do not, I will kick them out of the room for blockheads. What chap have you here?" Catherine satisfied his curiosity. "Tilney," he repeated. I do not know him. A good figure of a man, well put together. Does he want a horse? Here is a friend of mine, Sam Fletcher, has got one to sell. That would suit anybody. Famous clever animal for the road. Only 40 guineas. I had 50 minds to buy it myself, for it was one of my maxims always to buy a good horse when I meet one. But it would not answer for my purpose. It would not do for the field. I would give any money for a real good hunter. I have 3 now, the best that ever were backed. I would not take 800 guineas for them. Fletcher and I mean to get a house in Leicestershire against the next season. So damned uncomfortable living in an inn. This was the last sentence by which he could weary Catherine's attention, for he was just then borne off by a resistless pressure of a long string of passing ladies. Her partner now drew near and said, "That gentleman would have put me out of patience had he stayed with you half a minute longer. He has no business to withdraw the attention of my partner from me. We have entered into a contract of mutual agreeableness for the space of an evening, and all our agreeableness belongs solely to each other for that time. Nobody can fasten themselves on the notice of one without injuring the rights of the other. I consider a country dance as an emblem of marriage. Fidelity and complaisance are the principal duties of both, and those men who do not choose to dance or marry themselves have no business with the partners or wives of their neighbours. But they are such different things that you think they cannot be compared together? To be sure not. People that marry can never part, but must go and keep house together. People that dance only stand opposite each other in a long room for half an hour. And such is your definition of matrimony and dancing. Taken in that light, certainly their resemblance is not striking, but I think I could place them in such a view. You will allow that in both, man has the advantage of choice, woman only the power of refusal. That in both, it is an engagement between man and woman, formed for the advantage of each, and that when once entered into, they belong exclusively to each other, till the moment of its dissolution. That is their duty, each to endeavour to give to the other no cause for wishing that he or she had bestowed themselves elsewhere. Their best interest to keep their own imaginations from wandering towards the perfections of their neighbours, or fancying that they should have been better off with anyone else. You will allow me this. In one respect, there is certainly a difference. In marriage, the man is supposed to provide for the support of the woman to make home agreeable for the man. He is to purvey, and she is to smile. But in dancing, their duties are exactly changed. The agreeableness, the compliance are expected from him, while she furnishes the fan and the lavender water. That, I suppose, was the difference of duties which struck you as rendering the conditions incapable of comparison. And there I will leave you to gather your thoughts about these two gentlemen. Diana.
I'd unmuted myself. Thank you, Matthew. We're now going to go over to Angela.
Thank you,
Are you there, Angela? Yes.
I'm going to read from Emma, Volume 3, Chapter 4, the scene where Harriet Smith brings her most precious treasures to Emma. It's such a sweet scene, and it shows Jane Austen's sense of the absurd to perfection. A bit of background. Emma has persuaded Harriet to turn down Robert Martin's proposal of marriage. Then she persuades Harriet to fall in love with Mr. Elton, who she insists is in love with her. Now, Mr. Elton has gone and got himself engaged to somebody else. Poor Harriet. Meanwhile, Emma has persuaded herself. This book really ought to be called Persuasion. She's persuaded herself that she's in love with Frank Churchill, until now, when she's discovered she's not in love with Frank Churchill. So when Frank Churchill arrives at the gates of Hartfield with Harriet, leaning against him almost in a faint, having been frightened by some gypsies, Emma, seeing them together, plots another match. A very few days had passed after this adventure with the gypsies, when Harriet came one morning to Emma with a small parcel in her hand, and after sitting down and hesitating, thus began. "Miss Woodhouse, if you are at leisure, I have something that I should like to tell you, a sort of confession to make. And then, you know, it will be over." Emma was a good deal surprised, but begged her to speak. There was a seriousness in Harriet's manner which prepared her, quite as much as her words, for something more than ordinary. "It is my duty, and I am sure it is my wish," she continued, "to have no reserves with you on this subject. As I am happily quite an altered creature, in one respect, it is very fit that you should have the satisfaction of knowing it. I do not want to say more than is necessary. I am too much ashamed of having given way as I have done, and I dare say you understand me." "Oh yes," said Emma. "I hope I do." "How I could be so long fancying myself," cried Harriet warmly. "It seems like madness. I can see nothing at all extraordinary in him now. I do not care whether I meet him or not. Except of the two, I would prefer not to see him. And indeed, I would go any distance round to avoid him. But I do not envy his wife in the least. I neither admire her nor envy her, as I have done. She is very charming, I dare say, and all that. But I think her very ill-tempered and disagreeable. I shall never forget her look the other night. However, I assure you, Miss Woodhouse, I wish her no evil. No, let them be ever so happy together. It will not give me another moment's pang. And to convince you that I have been speaking truth, I am now going to destroy what I ought to have destroyed long ago, what I ought never to have kept. I know that very well," blushing as she spoke. "However, I will now destroy it all, and it is my particular wish to do it in your presence that you may see how rational I have grown. Cannot you guess what this parcel holds?" said she, with a conscious look. "Not the least in the world. Did he ever give you anything?" "No, I cannot call them gifts, but they are things that I have valued very much." She held the parcel towards her, and Emma read the words, "Most precious treasures," on the top. Her curiosity was greatly excited. Harriet unfolded the parcel, and she looked on with impatience. Within abundance of silver paper was a pretty little Tunbridge ware box, which Harriet opened. It was well lined with the softest cotton. But, excepting the cotton, Emma saw only a small piece of court plaster. "Now," said Harriet, "you must recollect." "No, indeed I do not." "Oh dear me, I should not have thought it possible you could forget what passed in this very room about court plaster, one of the very last times we ever mentioned it. It was but a very few days before I had my sore throat, just before Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley came, I think the very evening. Do not you remember his cutting his finger with your new penknife, and your recommending court plaster? But as you had none about you and knew I had, you desired me to supply him, and so I took mine out and cut him a piece, but it was a great deal too large, and he cut it smaller, and kept playing with it some time with what was left before he gave it back to me. And so then, in my nonsense, I could not help making a treasure of it. So I put it by, never to be used, and I looked at it now and then as a great treat." "Oh, my dearest Harriet," cried Emma, putting her hand before her face and jumping up, "you make me more ashamed of myself than I can bear. Remember it? Aye, I remember it all now. All except your saving this relic. I knew nothing of that till this moment. But the cutting of the finger, and my recommending court plaster, and saying I had none about me. Oh, my sins, my sins. And I had plenty all the while in my pocket. Oh, one of my senseless tricks. I deserve to be under a continual blush all the rest of my life." "Well, go on." "And had you really some at hand all the time? I am sure I never suspected it. You did it so naturally." "And so you actually put this piece of court plaster by for his sake," said Emma, recovering from her state of shame and feeling divided between wonder and amusement. And secretly she added to herself, Lord bless me. When should I ever have thought of putting by in cotton a piece of court plaster that Frank Churchill had been pulling about? I never was equal to this. Here, resumed Harriet, turning to her box again, here is something still more valuable. I mean, that has been more valuable, because this is what really did once belong to him, which the court plaster never did. Emma was quite eager to see this superior treasure. It was the end of an old pencil, the part without any lead. This was really his, said Harriet. Do not you remember one morning? No, I dare say you do not. But one morning, I forget exactly the day, but perhaps it was the Tuesday or Wednesday before that evening, he wanted to make a memorandum in his pocketbook. It was about spruce beer. Mr. Knightley had been telling him something about brewing spruce beer, and he wanted to put it down. But when he took out his pencil, there was so little lead that he soon cut it all away, and it would not do. So you lent him another. And this was left upon the table, as good for nothing. But I kept my eye on it, and as soon as I dared, caught it up and never parted with it again from that moment. I do remember it, cried Emma. I perfectly remember it. Talking about spruce beer, yes. Mr. Knightley and I both saying we liked it. And Mr. Elton seeming resolved to learn to like it too. I perfectly remember it. Oh, stop. Yes, Mr. Knightley was standing just here, was not he? I have an idea he was standing just here. Oh, I do not know, I cannot recollect. It is very odd, but I cannot recollect. Mr. Elton was sitting here, just about where I'm sitting now. Well, go on. Oh, well, that's all. I have nothing more to show you or to say, except that I am now going to throw them both behind the fire, and I wish you to see me do it. My poor dear Harriet. And have you actually found happiness in treasuring up these things? Yes, simpleton that I was. I am quite ashamed of it now, and wish I could forget as easily as I can burn them. It was very wrong of me, you know, to keep any remembrances after he was married. I knew it was, but had not resolution enough to part with them. Oh, but Harriet, is it necessary to burn the court plaster? I have not a word to say for the bit of old pencil, but the court plaster might be useful. I shall be happier to burn it, replied Harriet. It has a disagreeable look to me. I must get rid of everything. And there it goes. And there is an end, thank heaven, of Mr. Elton. And when, thought Emma, will there be a beginning of Mr. Churchill?
When indeed. Thank you, Angela. Right, we're now moving across to Sabine.
And I'm going to read from The Real Persuasion, from Book 2, Chapter 11, which is a pivotal point near the end of the novel, which is set in the White Hart Inn in Bath. That was the busy main stagecoach inn in central Bath, a transitory place, the point of arrival, but also of departure to new destinations. For Anne Elliot, it becomes a point of departure in a metaphorical sense, as it leads to her marriage to Captain Wentworth, who loves her and appreciates her intelligence here on display. We find her on a morning call to friends who are in Bath on a shopping expedition. Anne is in conversation with Captain Harville, while Captain Wentworth seems busy writing a business letter, but is actually listening. The conversation starts with comments on a miniature painting of Captain Benwick. He had been engaged to Captain Harville's sister Fanny, but she died, and he is now going to marry Louisa Musgrove. Captain Harville is saying, "Poor Fanny, she would not have forgotten him so soon." "No," replied Anne in a low, feeling voice, "that I can easily believe. It was not in her nature. She doted on him. It would not have been in the nature of any woman who truly loved." Captain Harville smiled, as much as to say, "Do you claim that for your sex?" And she answered the question, smiling also. "Yes, we certainly do not forget you as soon as you forget us. It is perhaps our fate rather than our merit. We cannot help ourselves. We live at home, quiet, confined, and our feelings prey upon us. You are forced on exertion. You have always a profession, pursuits, business of some sort or other to take you back into the world immediately, and continual occupation and change soon weaken impressions. Granting your assertion that the world does all this so soon for men, which, however, I do not think I shall grant, it does not apply to Benwick. He has not been forced upon any exertion. The peace turned him on shore at the very moment, and he has been living with us in our little family circle ever since." "True," said Anne, "very true. I did not recollect, but what shall we say now, Captain Harville? If the change be not from outward circumstances, it must be from within. It must be nature, man's nature, which has done the business for Captain Benwick." "No, no, it is not man's nature. I will not allow it to be more man's nature than woman's to be inconstant and forget those they do love or have loved. I believe the reverse. I believe in a true analogy between our bodily frames and our mental, and that as our bodies are the strongest, so are our feelings, capable of bearing most rough usage and riding out the heaviest weather." "Your feelings may be the strongest," replied Anne, "but the same spirit of analogy will authorize me to assert that ours are the most tender. Man is more robust than woman, but he is not longer lived, which exactly explains my view of the nature of their attachments. Nay, it would be too hard upon you if it were otherwise. You have difficulties and privations and dangers enough to struggle with. You are always labouring and toiling, exposed to every risk and hardship. Your home, country, friends all quitted. Neither time, nor health, nor life to be called your own. It would be hard indeed," with a faltering voice, "if woman's feelings were to be added to all this." "We shall never agree upon this question," Captain Harville was beginning to say, when a slight noise called their attention to Captain Wentworth, hitherto perfectly quiet division of the room. It was nothing more than that his pen had fallen down, but Anne was startled at finding him nearer than she had supposed, and half inclined to suspect that the pen had only fallen because he had been occupied by them, striving to catch sounds which yet she did not think he could have caught. "Have you finished your letter?" said Captain Harville. "Not quite. A few lines more. I shall have done in 5 minutes. There's no hurry on my side. I am only ready whenever you are. I am in very good anchorage here," smiling at Anne, "well supplied and want for nothing. No hurry for a signal at all. Well, Miss Elliot," lowering his voice, as I was saying, we shall never agree, I suppose, upon this point. No man and woman would, probably. If I had such a memory as Benwick, I could bring you 50 quotations in a moment on my side of the argument, and I do not think I ever opened a book in my life which had not something to say upon woman's inconstancy. Songs and proverbs all talk of woman's fickleness. But perhaps you will say these were all written by men. Perhaps I shall. Yes, if you please, no reference to examples in books. Men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story. Education has been theirs in so much higher a degree. The pen has been in their hands. I will not allow books to prove anything. But how shall we prove anything? We never shall. We never can expect to prove anything upon such a point. It is a difference of opinion which does not admit of proof. We each begin probably with a little bias towards our own sex, and upon that bias build every circumstance in favour of it which has occurred within our own circle, many of which circumstances, perhaps those very cases which strike us the most, may be precisely such as cannot be brought forward without betraying a confidence, or, in some respect, saying what should not be said. Ah, said Captain Harbour in a tone of strong feeling, if I could but make you comprehend what a man suffers when he takes a last look at his wife and children and watches the boat that he has sent them off in, as long as it is in sight, and then turns away and says, God knows whether we ever meet again. And then, if I could convey to you the glow of his soul when he does see them again, when coming back after a 12-month's absence, perhaps, and obliged to put in another port, he calculates how soon it be possible to get them there, pretending to deceive himself and saying they cannot be here till such and such a day, but all the while hoping that 12 hours sooner, and seeing them arrive at last as if heaven had given them wings by many hours sooner still. If I could explain to you all this, and all that a man can bear and do and glories to do for the sake of these treasures of his existence. I speak, you know, only of such men as have hearts pressing his own with emotion. Oh, cried Anne eagerly, I hope I do justice to all that is felt by you and by those who resemble you. God forbid that I should undervalue the warm and faithful feelings of any of my fellow creatures. I should deserve utter contempt if I dared to suppose that true attachment and constancy were known only by woman. No, I believe you capable of everything great and good in your married lives. I believe you equal to every important exertion and to every domestic forbearance, so long as, if I may be allowed the expression, so long as you have an object. I mean, while the woman you love lives and lives for you. All the privilege I claim for my own sex, it is not a very enviable one, you need not covet it, is that of living longest, of loving longest, when existence or when hope is gone. This is, of course, enough encouragement for Captain Wentworth, who used the 5 minutes to write his marriage proposal to bring the novel to a happy conclusion.
Thank you, Sabine. Now we're going over to Janet.
Thank you. My reading includes another of those intense sets of feelings that Jane Austen could describe so well, that obsession that some people have with illness. This piece is from her last and unfinished novel, Sanditon. Here, Mr. Parker is talking about members of his family with Charlotte Hayward, the young visitor to that new developing seaside resort, and he reads her a letter from his sister. When they met before dinner, Mr. Parker was looking over letters. "Not a line from Sydney," said he. "He is an idle fellow. I sent him an account of my accident from Willingdon and thought that he would have vouchsafed me an answer. But perhaps it implies that he is coming himself. I trust it may. But here is a letter from one of my sisters. They never fail me. Women are the only correspondents to be depended on. Now, Mary," smiling at his wife, "before I open it, what shall we guess is to the state of health of those it comes from? Or rather, what would Sir Sidney say if he were here? Sidney is a saucy fellow, Miss Hayward, and you must know he will have it there is a good deal of imagination in my two sisters' complaints. But it really is not so, or very little. They have wretched health, as you have heard us say frequently, and are subject to a variety of very serious disorders. Indeed, I do not believe they know what a day's health is. And at the same time, they are such excellent, useful women and have so much energy of character that where any good is to be done, they force themselves on exertions which to those who do not thoroughly know them have an extraordinary appearance. But there really is no affectation about them, you know. They have only weaker constitutions and stronger minds than are often met with either separate or together. And our youngest brother, who lives with them, and who is not much above 20, I am sorry to say, is almost as great an invalid as themselves. He is so delicate that he can engage in no profession. Sidney laughs at him, but it really is no joke, though Sidney often makes me laugh at them all, in spite of myself. Now, if he were here, I know he would be offering odds that either Susan, Diana, or Arthur would appear by this letter to have been at the point of death within the last month. Having run his eye over the letter, he shook his head and began, "No chance of seeing them at Sanditon, I'm sorry to say. A very indifferent account of them indeed. Seriously, a very indifferent account. Mary, you will be quite sorry to hear how ill they have been and are. Miss Hayward, if you will give me leave, I will read Diana's letter aloud. I like to have my friends acquainted with each other, and I'm afraid this is the only sort of acquaintance I shall have the means of accomplishing between you. And I can have no scruple on Diana's account, for her letters show her exactly as she is, the most active, friendly, warm-hearted being in existence, and therefore must give a good impression." He read, "My dear Tom, we were all much grieved at your accident, and if you had not described yourself as fallen into such very good hands, I would have been with you at all hazards the day after the receipt of your letter, though it found me suffering under a more severe attack than usual of my old grievance, spasmodic bile, and hardly able to crawl from my bed to the sofa. But how were you treated? Send me all particulars in your next. If indeed a simple sprain, as you denominate it, nothing would have been so judicious as friction by the hand alone, supposing it could be applied instantly. 2 years ago, I happened to be calling on Mrs. Sheldon when her coachman sprained his foot as he was cleaning the carriage and could hardly limp into the house. But by the immediate use of friction alone steadily persevered in, and I rubbed his ankle with my own hand for 6 hours without intermission, he was well in 3 days. Many thanks, my dear Tom, for the kindness with respect to us, which had so large a share in bringing on your accident. But pray never run into peril again in looking for an apothecary on our account. For had you the most experienced man in his line settled at Sanditon, it would be no recommendation to us. We have entirely done with the whole medical tribe, We have consulted physician after physician in vain, till we are quite convinced they can do nothing for us, and that we must trust to our own knowledge of our own wretched constitutions for any relief. But if you think it advisable for the interest of the place to get a medical man there, I will undertake the commission with pleasure, and have no doubt of succeeding. I will soon put the necessary irons in the fire. As for getting to Sanderson myself, it is quite an impossibility. I grieve to say that I dare not attempt it. My feelings tell me too plainly that in my present state, the sea air would probably be the death of me. And neither of my dear companions will leave me, or I would promote their going down for a fortnight. But in truth, I doubt whether Susan's nerves would be equal to the effort. She has been suffering much from the headache, and 6 leeches a day for 10 days together relieved her so little that we thought it right to change our measures. And being convinced on examination that much of the evil lay in her gum, I persuaded her to attack the disorder there. She has accordingly had 3 teeth drawn and is decidedly better, but her nerves are a good deal deranged. She can only speak in a whisper, and fainted away twice this morning on poor Arthur's trying to suppress a cough. He, I am happy to say, is tolerably well, though more languid than I like, and I fear for his liver. I have heard nothing of Sydney since your being together in town, but conclude his scheme to the Isle of Wight has not taken place, or we should have seen him in his way. Most sincerely do we wish you a good season at Sanditon, and though we cannot contribute to your beau monde in person, we are doing our utmost to send you company worth having, and think we may safely reckon on securing you 2 large families. One, a rich West Indian from Surrey, the other a most respectable girls' boarding school or academy from Camberwell. I will not tell you how many people I have employed in the business, wheel within wheel, but success more than repays. Yours most affectionately, etc. Well, said Mr. Parker as he finished, though I dare say Sydney might find something extremely entertaining in this letter and make us laugh for half an hour together, I declare I, by myself, can see nothing in it but what is very pitiable or very creditable. With all their sufferings, you perceive how much they are occupied in promoting the good of others. So anxious for Sanditon. 2 large families, one for Prospect House probably, the other for number 2 Denham Place, or the end house of the terrace with extra beds at the hotel. I told you my sisters were excellent women, Miss Hayward. And Charlotte replies with concern and good sense. And of course she will encounter Diana and the others, as they will join them in Sanditon in due course. Doubtless the Parker family would have continued to show their own particular characteristics throughout this book. And it's so very sad we will never read Jane Austen's words to show us how.
Thank you, Janet. Now, the last reading is the poem Winchester Races, the last composition of Jane Austen. There's a slight mystery about the poem, as the manuscript from which it's been taken isn't in Jane Austen's handwriting. It's believed she dictated it to her sister Cassandra, which would make sense, as Jane was undoubtedly too weak to hold a quill. There's also a copy of the poem in which a change to the wording has been made. Instead of "when once we are buried, you think we are dead," the word "dead" has been altered to "gone." Again, the suggestion is Cassandra altered it, but we can't say for certain that was the case. We do know Jane composed it on St. Swithin's Day, July the 15th, 1817. possibly having seen an advertisement for the famous steeplechase races on Worthy Down. St. Swithin was the Bishop of Winchester, who at his death was buried outside the west door. Just over 100 years later, his remains were moved to a new shrine inside the cathedral. However, during the ceremony, there was a storm which the people of Winchester, or Venter, the old Roman name for the city, put down to the saint's annoyance at being removed from the fresh air, the rainstorm being his punishment. And that's how the legend of St. Swithin's Day started. Whatever the weather does on July the 15th, that will be the weather for the next 40 days. But the most remarkable thing about the poem is that she composed it just 3 days before she died, early in the morning of July the 18th, in her sister's arms. But perhaps we shouldn't find this remarkable, as Jane Austen's ability to overcome misery and difficulties was one of her most admirable qualities. She was someone who always looked on the bright side of life and found compensations in the face of distress. "Let other pens dwell on misery," she once wrote. I think it's fitting we end this week of discovery and celebration with something that reminds us of her humour and wit, and especially of her indomitable spirit, which could laugh at life even though she was facing death. Winchester Races. When Winchester Races first took their beginning, it is said the good people forgot their old saint, not applying at all for the leave of St. Swithin, and that William of Wykeham's approval was faint. The races, however, were fixed and determined. The company met, and the weather was charming. The lords and the ladies were satined and ermined, and nobody saw any future alarming. But when the old saint was informed of these doings, he made but one spring from his shrine to the roof of the palace which now lies so sadly in ruins, and thus he addressed them, all standing aloof. "O subjects rebellious, O Venter depraved, when once we are buried, you think we are dead. But behold me, immortal. By vice you're enslaved, you have sinned and must suffer." Then further he said, "These races and revels and dissolute measures with which you're debasing a neighbouring plain, let them stand, you shall meet with your curse and your pleasures. Set off for your course, I'll pursue with my reign. Ye cannot but know my command or July. Henceforward I'll triumph in showing my powers. Shift your race as you will, it shall never be dry. The curse upon Venter is July in showers." Well, we've come to the end of our week of events. We do hope you've enjoyed it. I know that there are several people here tonight who've been with us all week, so thank you very much indeed. It's lovely that you've been here again. And if anybody's missed any of our talks, they will be online on the BRLSI YouTube, so you can watch whenever you like. My thanks to all those who've contributed during the week, and especially to my readers this evening, but also to all of you and everyone who's tuned in, made donations, and been an enthusiastic audience, and especially to those people behind the scenes whom you do not see. So thank you all again, and good night.